We've talked about how the Constitution was developed in Philadelphia at the Constitutional Convention in 1787. And we've looked a little bit at the preamble to the Constitution and the first couple of articles that set up the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. Now we're going to take a look at the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments that were added to the Constitution. And remember, this was a compromise between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists. Anti-Federalists, like Thomas Jefferson, demanded that we add a Bill of Rights so that we would be able to guarantee in writing the basic rights of the people. Most people in this country, unfortunately, probably can't name all 10 of the Bill of Rights, all 10 of the First Amendments of the Constitution. Some of them are somewhat outdated. The Third Amendment is not really something we feel very relevant right now. The Third Amendment bans the government from forcing people to keep soldiers in their homes. Now we build military bases where soldiers can stay instead. But that was a major concern at the time that this was written, coming out of the experience of the Revolutionary War and what Britain had done to the colonists. So let's get started, and we'll start with the First Amendment, probably the most familiar to most people here. And I've got a bunch of images up here so that we can kind of go from image to concept and understand what the First Amendment really is all about. You see someone here protesting. I disagree, they say. We have a right to disagree with our government. We have a right to express that disagreement, the right to freedom of speech. So the First Amendment guarantees the rights of freedom of speech, religion. So we have these different religious symbols. And what we mean when we say we have freedom of religion is two things. First, individuals have the right to practice whatever religion that you choose. If you are Christian, Jewish, Buddhist, Muslim, if you are an atheist, it doesn't matter what your faith is or your lack of faith, you have a right to believe what you believe and to practice those beliefs. If you want to, bow your head before you take a test in school and quietly do that on your own, you have the right to do that. It also means, when we say we have freedom of religion, that the government can't force religion on anybody. That's the Establishment Clause. The government is not allowed to establish or create a religion. This is why school prayer is not constitutional. That's why it's not allowed or permitted for a principal, a teacher, a coach, anybody in any official position to lead a prayer or to suggest that students ever should pray. So that would be a violation of the First Amendment because it limits the rights of people who are in that setting. You're required to go to school. You shouldn't be forced to listen to a prayer or participate in prayer if you don't want to. That's your own freedom of religion. So freedom of speech, freedom of religion. I've got a newspaper here. Freedom of the press is a third thing in the First Amendment. The government is not allowed to tell the media what to write. So the government, if it gets annoyed because of negative comments about the president that some reporter is making, the government just has to live with that. Reporters are able to write what they want to write without any fear of the government preventing them from doing so. And then we have freedom of assembly here. I've drawn a bunch of people holding hands, standing together. You could imagine that group of people at a protest during the Civil Rights Movement, at a protest for equal rights of gays and lesbians today. You could imagine them at an anti-war protest. Whatever kind of setting that you might think that they might be participating in, people have a right to protest, to assemble, to gather. And the last thing is to petition their government, to ask their government publicly to change laws and to change the way that the government has handled a particular issue. So the First Amendment, freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion, freedom to assemble, and freedom to petition your government for a redress of grievances, to address your own concerns. Let's take a look then at the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment is very controversial, and people disagree about what the Second Amendment actually means. The Second Amendment says that because a well-regulated militia is necessary, then the right of people to keep and bear arms shall not be taken away. So when we look at that, some people argue that that means that because during the late 1700s, early 1800s, we relied on farmers and individual people with guns to protect the country. We didn't have our own standing military. that the government could not take away guns from people because we would need those guns for people to protect the country. That idea of a militia is one interpretation of the Second Amendment. Many people today believe that there is an absolute right to own guns in this country, and they read the Second Amendment as an amendment that prevents any efforts at gun control, limitations on gun ownership at all. So there's a debate of what exactly the Second Amendment means, just like there are also debates in the First Amendment about what types of speech might be permitted. You can't shout fire in a crowded theater, for example. There are examples of things that allow government to regulate the time, place, and manner of speech. And similarly, there's a debate about what the Second Amendment means and what limitations or rules the government can put in place with regard to gun ownership. Can we require permits? Generally, the courts have said yes. Can we require licenses? Can we require background checks? These are things that have been much discussed ever since the proliferation of school shootings in this country. I'm going to skip the Third Amendment and look now at the Fourth, Fifth, and Sixth Amendments together. These are considered amendments that deal with due process rights. That's the right of people who are accused of a crime to be treated fairly and to be presumed innocent. So the Fourth Amendment, first of all, says that government can't come into your house and look at your stuff, even if you're suspected of a crime, unless they have a search warrant. Same thing with a car. I've drawn a car here, you're driving down the road, the car is an extension of your person and your private property. Unless the police have a search warrant, they cannot search your car without your permission. So if a police officer comes up and says, "Can I see what's in your trunk of your car?" you don't have to say yes. You can say no. And they can't look at it unless they have a warrant. So that's how the Fourth Amendment protects us. It's called a protection against unreasonable search and seizure. The Fifth Amendment guarantees the right of people to remain silent so you don't incriminate yourself if you've been accused of a crime. You don't have to confess. You don't have to give the government evidence against yourself. The Sixth Amendment protects the right to an attorney and guarantees everybody who's been accused of a crime the right to legal counsel so that you don't have to go on your own in trying to disprove the government's case against you. The right to have a trial by jury is also covered by the Fifth and Sixth Amendments. And that means that we have a right to a speedy trial and to a jury of our peers. People like us from the town where we are living, where the crime was committed, so that we have a fair chance of being found not guilty if the evidence does not prove that we are in fact guilty of the crime we've been accused of. The Eighth Amendment prohibits the government from using unreasonable punishment, unusual punishment that is cruel against people who have been convicted of a crime. So, for example, the courts have ruled consistently that the death penalty is not cruel and unusual. People can be put to death, but the court has now ruled that the methods of the way that people are put to death have to change. People are required now to be put to death in most states by lethal injection, by a shot, rather than by firing squad or by hanging. Also, with regard to the Eighth Amendment, there's a continuous debate about how that should be interpreted in terms of what conditions are acceptable in prisons. People in prison are subject to terrible conditions, sometimes getting as little as 1 hour of sunlight a day, sometimes only being allowed out of their cell for an hour a day for recreation in an indoor cage. So prison conditions are very bad in many parts of the country, especially in some of the higher segregation units, some of the higher security units. And there are ongoing debates about what actually is meant by cruel or unusual punishment. And then the Ninth and Tenth Amendments reserve any rights to the people in the Ninth Amendment that the Constitution or the Bill of Rights forgot to mention. In other words, if the Ninth Amendment says that if the Constitution doesn't give a right to the government, then people retain that right. And the Tenth Amendment says that if powers are not granted to the federal government, then states keep those powers themselves. So that was put in to help keep the anti-federalists happy and alleviate the concern anti-federalists had, who feared that the federal government was going to come in, take power away from the states. So the Ninth Amendment ends up being very important in terms of the right to privacy and arguments about what privacy rights, along with the Fourth Amendment and Ninth Amendment, both deal with privacy rights that have been used to establish the constitutional right of a woman to make her own choices about her body and whether to have an abortion or not. So the Bill of Rights encapsulates the first 10 amendments of the Constitution. There are other amendments, very important. The 13th abolishes slavery, the 14th creates the Equal Protection Clause, the 15th guarantees the right to vote to African Americans, the 19th Amendment gives women the right to vote. So a number of amendments are very important throughout our history. But these are the first 10, and they're called altogether the Bill of Rights. They were demanded by the Anti-Federalists and Thomas Jefferson, and they were finally introduced by James Madison in the very first session of Congress.